You don't have to be like super unique. You just have to be unique within the application pool. This person is really great. I like them. I recommend them. It's a pretty weak letter. If your recommenders brag about you, it carries more weight than you doing it about yourself. I knew like Harvard would grill me on the entire application, or I had to be able to know every single thing. Make sure you have breaks for yourself. Otherwise, you'll get burned out and your essays and interviews will suffer for it.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is JJ. I'm a moderator at GMAT Club, and today I'll be having an interesting session with Evan. So Evan got into quite a number of schools. He got into HBS, he got into MIT Sloan, NYU Stern, UC Berkeley Haas, and Kellogg School of Management. So we'll be speaking with Evan about his application journey, pretty much documenting the different steps, I mean, the journey from start to finish up until now. And also, we hope that we'll be able to glean some insights from his own application cycle. So we're hoping that as many people as can watch this video as possible will be able to learn so much from it. And we hope that this will be able to help you. So over to you, Evan. Tell us about yourself. I think that's the typical question admissions interviewers usually ask.
Yeah. I'll just quickly touch on myself. I'm Evan. I'm a engineer over in the biotech sector. I've basically been doing that since I graduated college, and I've been doing that for the last 5 years. And then I went to school in the U.S. And then, and I guess quickly, maybe we'll touch on it a little bit later. But in terms of why I applied to get my MBA, I'm in a technical function right now, and I wanted to move into more of a commercial function.
Sounds great. I think it pretty much resonates with quite a number of people out there. I think it's one of the key reasons why many people pursue an MBA. So, Evan, tell us a little bit about your academic background. Like, what were you doing? I know you mentioned engineering, but a little bit more about the industry or the kind of projects you were working on up until this point.
Yeah. So I guess in college, I was a combined major. So I majored in chemical engineering. And then I also did a little bit of biochemistry once I knew I wanted to go into life sciences. And then in terms of projects at work, it's kind of been a mix. I've been fortunate enough to like work in a group where there's like a good variety of projects. In the beginning, when I first joined, I didn't have that many options. I was working at one like the few, I won't say the name, but it'll be pretty easy to find, I guess. It's one of the companies that were working on the COVID vaccines during the pandemic. So when I first joined, that was the only project I could work on. And then as that started to wind down, I started to get a little bit more involved with some other projects similar to COVID, but just, different names. And then I also started getting involved in some clinical trial work, mainly for rare diseases. And yeah, so it's been basically since then, it's also been a bunch of manufacturing. So I'd say it's been a lot of COVID focused work, a lot of like manufacturing focused work, and then a lot of clinical trial focused work.
Great. And you've done this for how long now?
I've been doing this for about 5 years.
Interesting, interesting. I think this pretty much falls at about the average of MBA programs. Okay, so let's dive right into the MBA experience. At what point did you realize that it was time for you to go for your MBA? And I mean, how did you go about selecting your schools?
Yeah. So in terms of MBA, I think for me, working in pharma, working in biotech, one of the things I kind of realized really early on was, these were places that wanted a PhD or MD or MBA at some point if you wanted to keep climbing. Uh, and so I knew the last two degrees weren't for me. I knew I probably need to get an MBA at some point. And then the other thing was I think I wanted to move into more of a commercial function, but it seemed like that's a pretty hard function to move into. It seemed like you needed to come either from consulting or uh, it didn't seem like they had many entry level positions. You had to come in from MBA recruiting, it almost seemed like. So that's kind of why. And then in terms of why the schools, yeah, that's a good question. I feel like this is kind of variable between people, but the first thing that I did, I guess, and how I decided my round one schools was I didn't want to do round two applications. So I picked schools in round one where if I got into any of them, I just wouldn't apply to anywhere in round two. Um, and then in terms of how I selected like the specific schools, um, did you want me to run through like them specifically or just talk about them as a whole or?
I think you can just talk about them as a whole.
Okay, yeah. So I think for me, it was really like, so for me, I still want to stay in healthcare. I still want to stay in biotech. So it was really about which schools are good for that, whether it's like the program strength itself or the location. So that was really what I did to really narrow like the whole big list of all the schools into like maybe like 8 or 9 manageable ones. Um, and then from there, I kind of did like some cultural fit, some like weighting rankings. So like for me, um, Boston is convenient, so I don't have to move, for example, right? So I decided to include HBS at MIT in round one. And then I think for like just like I think I culturally felt like I really liked the last three schools. So I kind of bumped them into the five to like round it out.
Great. So, I mean, pretty much just to be sure that I get you clearly, you started with a list of nine and then you shortlisted them down to five, right?
Yeah, I mean the nine number isn't totally exact. It was just like I needed to figure out what schools that I liked for
Right.
health, and then from there I
Right.
just kept narrowing it down.
Right. So you made mention of something very important. You spoke about ensuring that these schools were a great culture fit for you. So I think it's a common catchphrase in the MBA application lingo. I mean, you go on Reddit, you go on GMAT Club, everybody talks about culture fit. For you, how did you assess the cultural fit for all the schools? What were the things you looked out for? Was it the responsiveness of the outcome? Was it the vibe that you got from the first or second year students? Was it the campus? What exactly did cultural fit mean to you?
Yeah, I that's a great question, and I still have a ton of trouble figuring it out. But I think for me, like I kind of knew like I'm trying to be. I feel like I'm a little bit more laid back, not like super laid back, but not like your typical like super. I don't know how to say
Conservative.
that. And so for me, that was kind of what I was assessing. Um, and so I think it kind of I didn't do culture fit for a ton of schools. Like I think for me, like it was easiest for the New York schools and the Chicago schools because I was basically comparing them to each other. Um, but yeah, I kind of did basically exactly what you did, right? I kind of went to some admission events, mainly student focused rather than like admissions focused. Trying to see like how the students talked, how like you know if they were like super friendly, was it easy to email them? Um, Also, just like kind of how they talked. I noticed like I don't know. I guess like for example, I didn't apply to Booth, but like for example, you always hear like Kellogg is more outgoing, Booth is a little bit more quiet, kind of deal. So I kind of just took notes, and um, that was the thing. And then I will say, like, I definitely think talking to students is helpful, and I think that was really helpful. And I didn't do a ton of it, but I did weigh that into my criteria just to see like how responses how responsive were the students. Like I kind of used that as a gauge to like when I become a student, how responsive will the alumni be? So I think to summarize, it was really just like um, admissions events, but ones that were focused on students. And then once I was in those events, just like taking some notes around the culture, what I wanted, and then also just kind of like you mentioned, talking to students directly.
Okay, so I mean, it's great to hear. And I think as a follow up to this, were any communities particularly beneficial to you during this application build up process, or it was just you doing your own thing freestyle, like reaching out to people via LinkedIn, via the school websites, and all of that? Or did you join specific groups, maybe like WhatsApp or anything, just to get a closer idea of how things worked generally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't join any groups. I didn't know there were groups. So cool that you're mentioning them. I think if there are, you should. I kind of wish I joined them, but no, I didn't. I didn't know anyone else that was really getting an MBA, so I just kind of used the schools and their offerings, and then sometimes there would be like breakout rooms or panels in those events, and students would like drop their email or LinkedIn, and then I would just go from there. I found that was a little helpful as opposed to like um, cold messaging them sometimes, just because I could say like, "Hey, I met you at this Kellogg event or this like Haas event, and I wanted to connect," kind of deal.
Well, that sounds like a whole lot of stress. Having introduce yourself to a bunch of applicants. So the reason why I asked was obviously because with GMAT Club Forum, there is a large group for each of the different schools, not just in the US. There's a group for European schools as well, and it's a large community. And just as Ivan has mentioned, it will be great if many more persons can join, get a lot of information. This is in addition to the web forum where you can get all kinds of information. So just wanted to put that out there. So now let's dive into the application process itself. You
Mhm.
mentioned that you applied in round one, and we know that round one deadlines typically hover around September to October. So how was your own timeline? And when I say timeline, I'm speaking about how much time did you dedicate to different phases of your application, including writing your essays, writing your standardized tests, interacting with the student community or the alumni community, attending programs. What was your own timeline like?
Yeah. I'll start with the GMAT. I feel like that's the big one. I started in January, kind of. I was studying a little bit the year before, but then I think that was when I switched from classic to focus, so I stopped. But yeah, I guess I really started studying in January, and then I studied for about 5 months, I guess, and took my first test in May. Um, I will say, like, maybe that's not ideal. I think it would be better almost to, like, if I had taken my first test in April. Um, and then but then from there, I took my I wanted to basically build in room for a retake, because just in case I needed to. Like, I actually did pretty terrible on my first take. Um, and then I just booked my second take in June, and then I got the score I wanted. I was a little bit lucky, but I think, if I had started in April and let's say I did my retake in May, um, I would have still had June to do a third retake if I needed it. Whereas I think if I, in my boat, I kind of had to just say, like, whatever I get in June will be the score I use, because I wanted to start focusing on the essays and the applications. So I think I'll touch on essays and application last. I'll quickly touch on, like networking with students and whatnot. Um, so I network with students mostly in the spring. Um, And one thing I will maybe give advice for people is, if you're planning to apply to like an MBA, maybe try during like the fall and the spring. I think I was a little kind of stupid. At some point, I was like, every student is on summer vacation or on summer internship. So, like, I'm not getting a response for anything at this point. And all the campuses are kind of like empty. So I think if you can get as much networking in prior to the start of the summer, that is helpful, because I think you'll get more responses during the school year. Um, but yeah, in terms of essays and everything, I started my essays basically like a week after I finished my GMAT. Um, and I basically worked up to the day before each school's deadline. So, like, I submitted my essays at like midnight or like 1 in the morning kind of deal. Um, but I did try to make sure I was like keeping on track. Like, I think I finished like my first drafts for all my essays by like July, like the end of July. Um, and then I started revising them a little bit in August. And then I think I had my final draft basically like in the school's deadline. So, like, ours, obviously Harvard was the first one, so I had to do Harvard's first. But for me, I think that people have different strategies. Like, for me, I liked bouncing around different schools. Essays, just as an example, I remember I wrote something for her, one of the Harvard essays, and I was like, I like that. I want to, you know, take that story and use it in a different application. And then I kind of just switched what I was doing. Or, they always tell you know your MBA story, and I think bouncing around the different essays, I think my story was a little bit better versus if I had just said this month is the NYU story, so I'm just going to focus on the NYU story. Um, so yeah, I think for me it was helpful to bounce around the different schools' essays.
Great. So, just to do a recap of the things you said, you had mentioned that you started your preps pretty much January. That's the start of the year.
Mhm.
And you wished you had started engaging with students before maybe many of them went on their summer internships, which I think usually comes up between, shall I say, April to June, if I'm not mistaken. But pretty much anyone who really wants to get maybe timely feedback from students. Even Evan is advising that you try and do that before many of them go on their summer break so that you have enough time to gather your responses and then weigh them together. And Evan also mentioned that he took his GMAT around April, and then he also created enough time for himself to take a retake. So I think that's something critical that a lot of people need to factor in, because what we've usually seen over time, or what I noticed was that many people would take maybe the standardized test the first time, and then they realize maybe for reasons due to not good enough scores, they then have to apply for the test waiver. So if you don't want to put yourself in that kind of situation, try as much as possible to get that out of the way. That's the test out of the way, and then so you can focus on other things. So speaking of the essays now, I think it will be nice to take a deeper dive into that, Evan. Like, what resources would you say helped you? And the reason why I'm asking is because I remember attending a session sometime a couple of months ago. I think so, sometime in June last year, and one of the presenters mentioned that, look, sometimes when you write an essay, don't be surprised if you have to edit it more than 15 times. So in your own case, how did you manage the essay edits, the rewrites? How many times or how many people did you have to show it to? What resources did you use to help you fine tune your story?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing like was before I started each essay or like started the essay writing process, I kind of knew like I didn't know anyone that was really applying to an MBA or like have much guidance. So I just kind of wanted to know like what is the missions looking for, and then try to make my essays a little bit more specific. So it was really like going to some admissions events, talking to students. I used a little bit of applicant lab to just round out that part. Um, and then I kind of forgot the question, but and then so that's what I used to kind of like figure out, you know, how I should frame my story. What should I talk about? What are some of the schools looking for? Um, and then I think in terms of like draft and writing, was there anything you were specifically looking for, like how I wrote them or like how many revisions? Was that the question?
Yeah, so speaking of, we're looking at five different schools now. There's HBS, MIT, Kellogg, UC Berkeley, and NYU Stern. I mean, one would imagine that there had to have been some kind of resources that you leaned on to get your story right. Though there are some schools that have similarities in their essays, but these five schools pretty much have unique essay formats. So, how were you able to tie your story according to each school's requirements? How were you able to bundle that together?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard question.
Yeah, you can take it per school actually, so maybe that would make it easier for you.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So I guess, well, I guess, in the process of like, you know, getting ready for application, talking to students, I used Applicant Lab a little bit and they had like different modules. You kind of have a bunch of stories written out. So like you have your career focused stories, you have like your personal focused stories, and stories mean like basically like if I got asked that in a behavioral interview, like, hey, I can point to this story. Um, and then a little bit also about like, you know, in down the road, you'll always get like, why do you want an MBA? Why now? Like, blah, blah, blah. And so also having that ready um, was important. But in terms of, I'll start with like maybe the YMBA part. I think for me, the YMBA, I think I was a little bit lucky in the sense that I kind of knew that just from the past 4 or 5 years of working. Um, I just knew I wanted to switch functions. So but I think I would like spend some time like refining the why MBA part because that's not really going to change from school to school. At least like it's you always get asked. I feel like maybe you can vouch for me, but every school will ask you like a why MBA story, like what are your career goals. So I think that's like the biggest return on investment, just getting that locked down. Um, and that's what I think I focused on first. And then maybe um, so for example, NYU is very like I felt like it was very how do you focus on like emotional intelligence kind of stuff. So I used a lot of stories focused around like working with people, managing people. I didn't talk a ton about like technical stuff and whatnot. Um, I think I actually forget. Well, I forget what the essays honestly were now at this point, but uh,
I
I think
think if I remember correctly, NYU had the Big Six. They had the change essay as well, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh,
there was. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Okay, now I'm remembering them. Yeah. So okay. Honestly, I don't remember why and how I picked the topics for some of these essays. I just kind of did. But I think one thing that really helped me was like I would take an essay topic and just like sit with it for a little bit. Like I know some student gave me advice was just go on a walk and do some reflection, and then you'll think of your essay prompt answers. So I think that is one piece of advice that I got for how to answer these essays. Like if you just sit down with the essay prompt in front of you and you like lock yourself in a room for an hour and try to respond, um, your essay will probably be like pretty bad. It's like for me, I wrote it like sentence by sentence. Doing like, oh, I would go on a walk, like, oh my god, I just thought of a sentence, or I'm on the bus, I just thought of a sentence. So I think that was something that really helped. But yeah, I think in terms of finding a story or like figuring out my story, I think you know it was a lot of talking to. I'll say one, I just kind of went on like a lot of long walks and reflected. Um, the other thing was that I found helpful because I didn't have anyone to talk to was just like bouncing around the school's essays. And I think as I did that, I was kind of like, this is not a good story. Like, I mean, I like it, but it's not that the best. And I was using this for this essay. Maybe I can repurpose the topic or something like that. Um, and then I think the third thing that did help was I at some point like I went to friends and family, who maybe don't know anything about the MBA, but I think they know you, hopefully. And I said like, does this sound like me? Like, am I just coming off as like an authentic person, or does it smell like BS? Um, and so I think I used friends and family for that part. But um, so yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer, but I think in terms of like story, I just used I started with like students and some like uh modules and whatnot to figure out like why MBA and then my behavioral stories. And then I think the piece of advice that I always got was to number two was write your essay slowly. Like you don't have to lock yourself in a room and um, force yourself. And that's I think the nice thing about giving yourself enough time to write these essays is that you can revise and you can kind of edit what stories you use or how you tell the story. And then the third piece of advice was then I started talking to like family and friends who like maybe in a consultant or someone, they don't really know me like over the course of 10 years. So, it was friends, family, coworkers, things like that, am I being authentic kind of deals? And maybe that is what I did.
Great. So I think key takeaways from there, I mean, which I would also strongly encourage. I mean, you had mentioned the importance of acknowledging the randomness of these essays. I mean, don't try and cram a lot of sentences within a short time and think you're going to come up with something spectacular. Sometimes it's just going to take sentence by sentence. You could be doing something random. You could be chatting with friends, remember some kind of punchline, jot it down on your notepad, and then infuse it into your essay later. I think you also emphasize the importance of showing your essays to close confidence. Could be your family, could be your friends. Let them assess, let them know whether, I mean, let them more or less sieve your essays for inauthenticity. I mean, they know you as well. They've known you for a long time, so they can tell when you're coming off as fake. I mean, assume that they are the outcome. Assume that they are the ones who can best relate with you personally. So yeah, that's key. So moving on now, I think there's something significant too about your application journey. I mean, you got significant scholarships from NYU Stern, from MIT, from Kellogg, and from UC Berkeley. I mean, HBS no scholarship, but oh well. What would you say were your key outstanding factors? I mean, obviously you can't know why you were given these scholarships, but for people who are looking to apply, what are the things you would really encourage or advise them to pay attention to as they approach their own application?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe this is a good point. I don't know exactly like what they liked about my profile or like application, but maybe I think two things. Um, so I think the first is um, your recommenders. I guess is the one point I didn't touch on. Um, by the way, like I would say, prep your recommenders in the start of the summer so they have the whole summer to write the essays that they're going to write. But I think for recommenders, I think they are important for one thing, which is, um, you know, and this is maybe something that all the schools like was I knew my recommenders well. Like I knew they were people were that could do two things. One, um, you know, maybe they were people who were really good at like storytelling, so they could take a really technical story and make it easy for a general audience to understand. And then the second thing was, these were people who were in a way willing to brag on my behalf. Like I think if you as an applicant write in your essay like I did XYZ, like I was the best person in my company and I saved the world, you're gonna probably get rejected. But like if your recommenders write that, then it's good. So I think for me I had pretty I want to say strong recommenders. Obviously you can't like see the letter, so I don't know what they wrote, but I got the sense that that's what they did. Um, I think the thing that I did was maybe helpful, I guess, in my application was I kind of took a top-down view of my application. So after I wrote like all my essays and whatnot, um, I kind of said, for my application, I wanted my application to be very healthcare focused. So like, if I need to make tweaks or if I need to do X, Y, Z, I'll do that. And so, for example, like I think obviously sometimes if there's like a diversity essay question or like a behavioral essay question, then you can't. But for me, it's like having a overall overarching application strategy. So for example, like Harvard, they went from one essay to three essays this year, and then I had a joint degree essay, so I had to write a fourth essay for them. Um, and so for me, I was basically saying like I want all my essays to be, for the most part, healthcare related. And so if I didn't really touch on it super well, I would come back and like tweak things. I would like keep coming back to my applications. So I think for me that helped in the sense because then I don't know how to put this. Maybe I guess coming into the application, they always say like, "What is unique about you? Like, what is your branding?" And so like I think I helped like it helped me because I think like maybe someone else isn't as passionate about healthcare. So like I'm branding myself as I'm the healthcare person. Like I know like this portion of healthcare, X portion of healthcare, Y portion of healthcare. Um, and I think that part might help. Like I think maybe for folks, find what makes you. They always say, but find what makes you unique. I guess it's cliche, but I think you know you don't have to be like super unique. You just have to be unique within the application pool. So
Great, great. I think that's extremely helpful. And I think you also touched on something extremely important, staying true to your story. I mean, if you were saying that you're looking to do, let's say for instance, consulting after your MBA, maybe consulting in healthcare in your case, I mean, or whatever case, stick to that story. Let it reverberate across the different sides of your application, including the essays that don't even require you to talk about your healthcare interests. Just find some way to reemphasize your interest in this particular career field, and then what outcomes you're looking to achieve. I think that really helps. That's really interesting. So now, just to briefly piggyback on the points around preparing your recommender. Now, there are several schools of thought or there have been several debates about, is it ideal to kind of create a sketch of this recommendation for your recommenders and then allow them to build on it, or you just want to highlight key achievements during your time working with them and then expect them to build on it? I mean, what's the key? What would you say is the winning strategy around having your recommender create a compelling story on your behalf?
yeah, so I think let me I guess start on like the first part. I guess is just managing your recommenders, and then I guess the part two is the storytelling part. So I think number one is just like prep. is like make sure your recommenders know like the school deadline. I think everyone knows that, but also lock in your recommenders kind of early. So like for example, it might be too early, but I locked in my recommenders in May. Like I told them like I'm applying to schools in September. Like, would you be willing to write my recommendations? Like the application portal doesn't open until June, but just like knowing that they were willing to do it. Um, and then I think just like so my recommender just wrote the essays in like July and submitted it. So I think this part is not super applicable, but I think for me, I wouldn't have micromanaged them either way. Like I think, you know, they're usually like your recommenders are usually higher up than you. They might be like a VP or something. So it's like I'm not gonna micromanage them. Like I'm just gonna tell them, hey, like, um, you know, can you? I'll just check in with you on July or like June to see if you have any questions. And then as August rolls around, maybe we can start preparing the final drafts because um, you don't want to be like us. They don't want to be writing like 5 different things during the during their summer vacation, I guess, in
Yeah.
like a week for applications. I think the one last piece I'll touch on that is that said, like also maybe the good thing for recommenders is a lot of the questions that the schools ask um, are the same thing. So maybe I'll get into like the content. So um, I prepared like an application, like little packet for my each of my recommenders, and in it I said like these are the school's questions. Well, actually, let me take a step back. So the first page of this packet was just like recommendations in general, like nothing school specific, but it was like, hey, this is what I'm going to plan to talk about in some of my essays. Um, this is like approximately when you'll start to expect to see the deadlines, like how the recommendations will work. Like you have to submit it on a link kind of deal. Um,
Okay.
Also, just like what else? But also telling them like, don't delete your draft. Like keep it in like don't make it like a school specific draft. Keep it a little general, like that piece of advice because they can they can definitely recycle between schools. Um, and then I think this is something that I did. I don't know if everyone else needs to do. Is my two recommenders knew each other, but I kind of also had an idea of like what maybe they'll talk about. So, like for example, one recommender I worked with mainly on like clinical trial work. One I worked on with like manufacturing and related projects, and then they both also worked with me on one big project. And then I said, like, hey, I'm having X person talk about the big project, so don't waste your like space talking about that big project. Um,
Okay.
I think this is what the other person's mainly going to write about. So please limit that if you're like, unless you really want to write about it. Um, but then in terms of like what else did I give them? Uh, so once I kind of ran through the logistics of recommendations, the other thing I gave my recommenders were anecdotes, kind of like, I had worked with them like with 4 years. I'm sure they had forgotten stuff. So I basically just gave them some anecdotes uh, that would kind of answer this close questions. I think there's always one that's like, how do you rank compared to your peers? I didn't really like say anything like that, but I just said like I just gave them like 6, 7, 8 kind of like leadershipy stories. I said like in case you needed something to jog your memory, like here's 8. Like you don't have to just if you wanted something, you can pick one of them to try to write about. If you wanted to like jog your memory, but I think that's the point, right? Like you don't want them to just like go in it blind. You can give them stories. But I think that part is helpful because it helps them write very specifically. I think if your recommender says, this person is really great, I like them, I recommend them, it's a pretty weak letter. Whereas if they say like, if they get into really, really specifics, then it's unique, it's a strong letter, it's really backing you up. So that's kind of what I did. And then I guess I'll actually one last thing that I'll touch on for recommenders is I don't know if people have this question. I think it's not an issue for like consultants and for bankers, but I didn't come from that. So, but like the matrix that so there's a matrix that like your recommenders have to score you on. I had to tell
Uh-huh.
them like, it's not a like performance review. Like, don't think of this as like a performance review. Think of it kind of as like a customer service survey. So that's the other big thing.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's it's really insightful, and I think it goes to show why you were able to put a very strong application together. Because obviously, I mean, admission committee members would always mention that aside standardized tests, they also pay attention to essays. They pay attention to the kind of work you've done, your pre-MBA work experience. They also pay strong attention to your letters of recommendation. So, I mean, key takeaways from you is preparing your LORs, as we call them, early enough.
Mhm.
Also preparing. I think you gave a very interesting comment regarding letting your recommenders know that look, this is not a job appraisal. It's more like customers' feedback. That way, they can be as genuine as possible. Because I mean, on the objective matrix, which is the first one, the recommenders will fill before going into the main letter, they have to score you on different metrics. Could be your interpersonal relationships, could be anything. I mean, don't expect or don't ask them to score you five on everything, because I mean obviously then it doesn't really tell the story about you as a human, as someone who is also prone to mistakes. So letting them understand that there should be that objective aspect of it. Yeah, so it's really helpful. So let's sublime. I think this is the probably the final part. Let's sublime into the interviews. So, how did you prepare for the interviews for this? I mean, five schools, and I mean, how did you navigate them? Aside, of course, the resources that are available on GMAT Forum, where you get to see the interview, the briefs from previous years or from other applicants. How did you prepare yourself for these interviews, and what were your key takeaways from them?
Yeah, so I think one so for me to answer your question, I'll kind of say like I'm gonna split my answer into like um first like Berkeley and Kellogg, and then the other three. And I'll do that just because I guess the first piece of advice is like know how your school conducts the interviews. So for example, I knew that Berkeley and for Kellogg, um, it I don't remember who they pick for you to interview, but um, know how they do it. Like for me, I knew that my interview for those they were only going to have my resume, so um, I could use the stories that I told in my essays again and just like rehash them. But I can, in that sense, like for schools that are just like resume based interviews, I just made sure I was able to talk about anything on my resume. Um, and just make sure I had like behavioral questions. Um, and then uh, also the other thing is if you haven't like maybe it was weak for your application, um, you really need to be able to like verbally say why MBA at this point, like because that you will get that question basically at every single school um, interview. So like there will be like some questions like why MBA, why this school, blah 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 that you'll get from every school. So I think it's good to prepare your answer for that. Um, and then the other three, um, which I guess is a little bit more school specific at this point, but MIT, NYU, and HBS. These are I knew would be like admissions staff would be performing my interviews, and it'd be admissions staff that had read my entire application. So I I think this is a little part is a little tricky. Like I this is so I don't know exactly what I did for these schools, but um, I can tell you what I did, but maybe I give you advice. But I guess for me, like it was nice that I got the Harvard interview because I knew like Harvard would grill me on the entire application, or I had to be able to know every single thing. So, and my Harvard interview came first. So like in that way, like knowing because I knew my entire application, the story in and out, I kind of knew how to like navigate it and prepare for that. So by the time I got to NYU and MIT, it was pretty easy to prepare. Um, but I think you know, if you're not interviewing for Harvard, if you're interviewing just for like an MIT and an NYU, I would say like they don't really go as in depth into your application. So just high level, kind of know what you wrote about, but then still practice your behavioral questions, practice like your YMBAs. Um, and in terms of some of the stuff that I use for that, I use a lot of like I think there's like debriefs in different places. So I use like I think there are some on GMAT Club, so I think I use the GMAT Club debriefs, um, and I just kind of use that to kind of gauge like what kind of questions and how many questions these interviewers will ask for like that school. Um, and then the other thing I did was practice like out loud, like in front of a mirror, in front of my like laptop, and recorded myself because you always sound better in your head, but like verbally and recording, you can tell if you're like kind of rambling or if you're just like answering the question on point. So I think that was something that was helpful.
Yeah, great. I think thanks a lot for sharing that. I think there is I would say an underrated side of the whole interview process that many people need to touch, or shall I say latch onto, and that is the interview debriefs. Because if you go on GMAT Club forum, for instance, and you check the interview debriefs, there is hardly any debrief you wouldn't see for the different schools you're looking for. And I
Mhm.
think it really helps a lot of people to settle into their own interview process, because in many cases you're going to get the same kind of questions verbatim, and it kind of just helps you settle in better. And I think you touched on something important as well, that's speaking in front of maybe a mirror or self-recording yourself, or even if possible having your friends and family kind of interview you as well and put you on the hot seat, because obviously you don't want to leave your interview feeling like you've bombed it entirely, and then you start to panic. So yeah, extremely important. So thanks a lot, Evan. I think now as we wrap up, it'll be nice to speak about some, shall I say, key tips, like things you wish you knew during your application process, right? Which would really help other candidates or other applicants to prepare better. So, what are I mean, in no order of importance, what are some of the key insights or tips you wish you knew when you were applying?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just kind of go in any order that because I have your permission. I think the number one thing is test score. So, I it took me quite a bit of time to get my test score. Like it took me like 6 months to get my test score, but I think something that's underrated is like your test scores are good for like 5 years, so you don't actually have to do them the year you're applying. Like, so that in terms of test score, my advice is just like get it knocked out as early as you can. Like it doesn't even have to be in the year you're applying. Like it takes, and I feel like test scores always take way longer than you think they will. So just get that knocked out of the way so you can focus on your story, your essays, and whatnot. Um, in terms of like recommendations and essays, I guess my piece of advice is like pick rock runners who will like literally like brag about you, like brag about your stories, because you can't do that in your essays. You kind of have to be humble to a sense in your essays, but your recommenders like they can brag about you, and I almost get the sense that like if your recommenders brag about you, it carries more weight than you doing it about yourself. Um, and then I think for interviews, I would say just like practice in front of a mirror, practice out loud. Um, and then I think the one thing I will say is maybe I guess also in terms of application, like I don't know if it sounds like mine has been very chaotic. It has. Like for me, like I kind of know that like I like to work in like a little bit of a chaotic environment. So like I didn't make a schedule. Like I made like a whole detailed this is what I'm going to write about on this week. This is what I'm going to write about that week. But I knew like I wasn't a scheduled person. And I'm sure even though someone gave great advice that it's making a schedule, I just threw it out. So I think know how you work. Like you'll get so much advice like when you're applying, like on how to apply and whatnot. But like ultimately it's you applying. So do what works best for you. Um, and then I guess the last piece that maybe we didn't talk too much about is like the like burnout and anxiety kind of deal. But like I think by like time the interviews rolled around, I was like really burned out. I was just like, "Ugh, I don't really like care. Like I'm just gonna go into these interviews." But like, so I was burned out. I think most people will be, but like try to figure out how to address it. Like maybe you can have breaks. Like I didn't, but like maybe you can take like a 2 week break from the end of your GMAT to the start of your applications. Um, Maybe after your applications are done, like take a little bit of time off before like interview season starts to roll around. Um, yeah, so I think make sure you have breaks for yourself, otherwise you'll get burned out and maybe your essays and interviews will suffer for it. Just mine did. Uh, and then the last piece is maybe like anxiety. Like, so I did this, but like I can tell you, like it doesn't help at all. Like, once you submit your application, you can't change anything about it, so there's no point in worrying about it. But
Right.
so like, um, once you submit your application and you've done your interviews, like scrolling through like decision trackers, like the one on GMAT Club or like the one on Clear Admit, I would try to like not do, just because it doesn't really help. Like you can't change anything about your profile at that point.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's extremely helpful because I was going to ask about how you navigated the post interview and pre decision phase. I think that is probably the most anxiety inducing phase where because you don't know what you're getting. You don't know if you're going to get in at all. You don't know whether you're going to get in with scholarship. You don't know whether you're going to be waitlisted. You don't know whether you're going to be rejected. So hearing how you navigated that. I mean, so key takeaways from you is don't even bother to check for those updates. Don't bother to check who has gotten decisions or who has gotten a phone call. Just operate on your own time and know full well that the schools are going to reach out to everybody who applied. So, I mean, just randomly now, looking at all the different compartments of the application journey, that's the tests, writing essays, recommendations, and interacting with schools, which part would you say was the most stressful for you, and which part would you say was the least stressful? I mean, no right or wrong answers. It would just be nice to get an idea of how you interpreted the situation.
Yeah, I think for me the least stressful was probably like my recommenders. Like I think for me, like I did a pretty good job of picking my recommenders. I knew like these were people who were like excited to write these letters, and so I didn't have to do too much on like, hey, it's August, like did you write the letter? Like they both finished their letters like really well ahead of schedule. They on their own asked questions ahead of time, so for me like the recommenders were pretty stress free. um, so pick your recommenders wisely. um, I think the most stressful part, I feel like it changes, but I think so probably I would say, it's a good question. Uh, Honestly, I would say the whole thing, but uh, uh, I think honestly maybe like the timing piece. Like I don't know. Like I know I said like get your test score knocked out early, but I don't think anyone does. Like even I'm pretty sure no one does is the thing. Um, but yeah, I think the timing piece is the most stressful part for me because I think it was like
Did you
in the
say timing?
yeah, like for example, like the GMAT, it was like I
Okay.
want this in June. I want this done in like April. And it was like June started to roll around. And then I knew like, okay, if I don't get my GMAT in June, like I'm gonna have 1 month to write my essay. So like that part is hard. Um, I think for me, like the essays were like, you know, hard because I was like, okay, like I only have one draft and it's like almost the end of July. Like what the heck is going on? Uh, and then yeah, so I think managing the timing, because I think even though you have like a long application season, it's not quite as long as it seems. So um, that part, time flies by, is what I'm saying.
Great. So, I mean, just to be sure, you had your recommendations locked down. I mean, you pretty much made that clear. So, it's understandable why that was the least stressful for you. Because, in contrast, based on what we see on comments, both on the GMAT Club WhatsApp forum as well as the web forum, we see a lot of persons fussing about the LORs, whether they should change it last minute, whether they should reach out to their recommenders again, whether further deadlines or whether the deadlines can be extended for submission. So it seems to be a whole lot of chaos. So hearing that that was the least stressful phase for you is really interesting. And then I think for the most stressful, you had mentioned that timing, that's compartmentalizing everything. I think it's also understandable because, as you mentioned, time flies by really quickly. And then before you know it, it feels as though you didn't even make use of the early start or early advantage that you thought you had. So yeah, I mean, I think that really helps. So congratulations once again, Evans, from all of us at GMAT Club. And I think it's really interesting to hear just how much information you were able to get from the GMAT forum as well. And that's why we also always encourage everyone to try as much as possible to use the resources available. I mean, for instance, I think you mentioned something interesting about the essays. So many people also do not realize that on GMAT Club forum, you can see all the essays ahead of time. So I think I was on one particular group some time ago, not the GMAT group, by the way, and it was for one of the schools. I think it was London Business School. And I think many people thought it was just going to be two essays. But then it took me pointing out to them that look, if you go on GMAT Forum, you would see that LBS has about maybe 6 or 7 other essays that they require applicants to write. And each
Mhm.
one of these essays has about maybe 300 to 400 word limit. So technically, you're writing about 8 essays altogether. Meanwhile, you thought it was just going to be two. So making use of resources like that will definitely help a lot of people to prepare better. So I mean, parting words, parting shots from you, final comments. What are your key pieces of advice for everyone as they navigate their own journeys?
Yeah, I think just try to be yourself or know what you want to write about when you do your application. I think it'll, you can't keep flip flopping, so really like lock that down. And then I think take care of yourself. I guess doing your application, it's a stressful part. It's a lot of burnout, a lot of anxiety. So, um, you know, manage it and keep yourself healthy.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this session, for watching the video. Feel free to, play all the previous videos to learn more about different application journeys. And as you've heard Evan's journey here, look forward to looking at more or look forward to watching more videos, which we'll be uploading as the weeks go by. As I mentioned, check the GMAT forum for as many resources as you need, such as essays, essay insights, test preparations, interview debriefs, and every other thing. And we look forward to joining you or to welcoming you at our next session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.